Greetings everybody, Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. We are in the middle of the novella by Chris Metzen of Blood and Honor, and it's so far it's just been Tirion Fordring, and he had a one-on-one combat with a anonymous orc, and they did it kind of like in this burnt out tower, and the tower collapsed on them and darkness descended. So stay a while and listen as we come into chapter 2. This is just, like I said before, only an 8-chapter little experience, so we'll be a quarter of the way done as soon as we finish this one. Chapter 2 is called Unanswered Questions. Sunlight cascaded down from the open skylight in the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. Dust motes spiraled in a lazy dance blown by the soft wind that wafted through the grandiose hall. Rows of large white candles stood before the base of an immense triptych window of stained glass. The image of a proud regal warrior was depicted in the window. Thousands of tiny colored shards of glass portrayed the man's broad features and noble bearing. Surrounded by a halo of golden light, the man held a mighty warhammer in one hand and a large leather-bound tome in the other. The inscription on the tome read, Esarus dar nodarador, by blood and honor we serve. Tirion Fordring looked up toward the colorful image and felt his spirit soar. Kneeling upon an ornately carved dais, Tirion humbly bowed his head in prayer. To his left, a group of somber men dressed in flowing white robes stood in attendance. They were clerics, warrior priests, who hailed from the Northshire region. The pious clerics were present in order to offer Tirion their support and spiritual guidance, should he require it. To his immediate right, another group stood in observance, all dressed in heavy suits of highly polished armor. They were the Knights of the Silver Hand, the Paladins. The Shining Paladins were the champions of Lordaeron and the Alliance. They stood in support of Tirion, the newest initiate to their hallowed ranks. Before him was a vast altar that lay directly beneath the enormous stained glass window. The streaming sunlight was focused at the center of the altar, where another robed man sat in meditative silence, cradling a large book in his lap. Tirion was only vaguely aware of the others gathered in the cathedral behind him, chatting anxiously while waiting for the ceremony to begin. The robed man on the altar raised his hand, calling for the gathered masses to fall silent. Tirion held his breath. This was the moment for which he had waited. The robed man stood and slowly walked forward to address the kneeling Tirion. The archbishop stopped as he reached the ornate dais and opened the large book he had been holding. With a voice like thunder, the archbishop read aloud. In the light we gather to empower our brother. In its grace he will be made anew. In its power he shall educate the masses. In its strength he shall combat the shadow. And in its wisdom he shall lead his brethren to the eternal rewards of paradise. Finishing the verse, the archbishop closed the book and turned toward the men on the left. Tirion felt a rush of excitement sweep through his body. He breathed in deeply and tried to focus on the solemnity of the moment. Clerics of the Northshire, if you deem this man worthy, place your blessings upon him, the archbishop said in a ritualistic tone. One of the white-robed men walked forward, carrying an embroidered dark blue stole in his hands. The cleric reached the dais and reverently placed the blessed stole around Tyrion's neck. He dipped his thumb in a small vial of sacred oil and anointed Tyrion's sweating brow with it. And like I've mentioned at the beginning of the last episode when I kind of went off on a tangent, this scene informs the novel that we read, Arthas, Rise of the Lich King. So she got the ceremony, I'm guessing, straight up from this book, or this novella. By the grace of the light, may your brethren be healed, the cleric said in a whisper. He bowed and backed away to stand once more amongst his fellows. The archbishop turned to the men on the right and spoke again. Knights of the Silver Hand, if you deem this man worthy, place your blessings upon him. Two of the armored men moved forward with obvious pride on their faces and stood solemnly in front of the dais. One of the men held a great two-handed warhammer. The hammer's silvery head was etched with holy runes, and its haft was meticulously wrapped in blue leather. Tirion could only marvel at the weapon's exceptional craftsmanship and beauty. The knight laid the hammer on the dais before Tyrion's feet. He then bowed his head and backed away. The second knight, carrying dual ceremonial shoulder plates, stepped forward and looked Tirion in the eye. He was Sidon Dathrohan, one of Tyrion's closest friends. The knight's face was alight with pride and excitement. Tirion smiled knowingly. Visibly composing himself, Sidon placed the silver shoulder plates upon Tyrion's shoulder and spoke in a stern voice. "By the strength of the light, may your enemies be undone." After he finished speaking, Sidon, I don't know how I want to say that, maybe Sidon, adjusted the silver plates so that the blue stole streamed out from beneath them. He backed away and returned to the group of attendant knights. Tyrion's heart pounded in his chest. He was so overcome with joy that he felt almost lightheaded. The archbishop strode forward once again and placed his hand upon Tyrion's head. And if you remember from our earlier readings, Sidon was one of the original 5 paladins. "Arise and be recognized," he said. Tirion got to his feet and marveled at the sheer magnitude of the honor being bestowed upon him. The archbishop leveled his gaze at Tirion, then read aloud from the book. "Do you, Tirion Fordring, vow to uphold the honor and codes of the Order of the Silver Hand?" "I do," Tirion replied earnestly. "Do you vow to walk in the grace of the light and spread its wisdom to your fellow man?" "I do." "Do you vow to vanquish evil wherever it be found and protect the weak and innocent with your very life?" Tirion swallowed hard and nodded while saying, "By my blood and honor, I do." He exhaled softly, overcome with emotion. The archbishop closed the book and walked back toward the center of the altar. Turning to face the entire assembly, the archbishop said, "Brothers, you who have gathered here to bear witness, raise your hands and let the light illuminate this man." Each of the clerics and knights raised their right hands and pointed toward Tirion. To Tyrion's amazement, their hands began to glow with a soft golden radiance. He supposed that, in the excitement of the moment, his eyes were playing tricks on him, yet as he watched and wondered, the sunlight that poured in from above began to move slowly across the floor. As if in response to the assembly's command, the light came to rest upon Tirion himself. Partially blinded by the intense radiance, Tirion felt his body warmed and energized by its holy power. Every fiber of his being was ignited by divine fire. He could sense life-giving energies flowing through his limbs, energies enough to heal any wound or cure any disease. He mused that these energies were enough to burn even the souls of the accursed denizens of the shadow. Despite himself, he shuddered involuntarily. Ablaze with hope and joy, Tirion knelt down and took hold of the mighty hammer, the symbol of his holy appointment and station. With joyous tears streaming down his face, he raised his head and looked toward the archbishop, who smiled warmly back at him. "Arise, Tirion Fordring, paladin defender of Lordaeron. Welcome to the Order of the Silver Hand." The entire assembly erupted in cheers. Trumpets blared from the high balconies, and the cheerful din echoed through the vastness of the Cathedral of Light. Tirion woke with a start. The sound of children's frolicking laughter came through the nearby window. Outside he could hear the familiar sounds of commerce and trade being conducted within the grounds of Mardenhold Keep. He was home, in his own bed. Shaking his head to clear his groggy mind, he wondered how long he had slept. His sheets were soaked with sweat, and he smelled as if he hadn't bathed in a week. His head was pounding so hard he felt as if it would burst. Sighing heavily, he remembered that he had been dreaming. He tried to recall the dream's details, but due to the incessant pounding in his skull, he could only grasp the faintest flashes of imagery. A robed man, a shiny hammer, and a vicious orc. A vicious orc? He surmised that he had dreamt of his appointment as a paladin, but surely there were no orcs present at that joyous ceremony. Slowly, more images began to flash in his mind. There had been a fight between himself and the orc, and he had lost. Nonsense, he thought absently. He mused that his dreams were becoming even more imaginative in his old age. Lifting his head from the sweat-soaked pillow, he attempted to get up and out of bed. A searing pain shot through him, and he lay back down, panting for breath. He stripped the blankets from his body and saw that his entire midsection had been neatly bandaged. Bruises and small lacerations covered most of his aching body. He was surprised to find that his arm had also been dressed and bandaged. Frantically, he tried to recall what had happened to him. Had the fight against the orc been real? For some strange reason, his memory seemed hazy and sluggish. His face contorted with pain as he struggled out of bed. Wrapping himself in his dressing robe, he made his way toward the sitting room of his private chambers. He found his young wife, Karandra, sitting quietly with her needlework in a large plush chair near an open window. At seeing him enter the room, Karandra threw down her embroidery and rushed to meet him. She hugged him warmly, careful not to squeeze him too tightly. Thank the light you're awake, she said. Her young, delicate features were fixed with both relief and concern. Well, they already said he's over 50, so if he's got a young wife, he's kind of icky. Her blue eyes seemed to stare straight through him, as they always did. He smiled back and kissed her forehead lightly. He marveled for perhaps the 10,000th time at her beauty. I was beginning to wonder if you were going to sleep clear through mid-year, she said. His eyebrow arched questioningly as he stroked her soft golden hair. What do you mean? How long have I slept? He asked. Nearly 4 days, she replied flatly. Tirion blinked in disbelief. 4 days, he mumbled to himself. That would explain the hazy memory, he mused. Rondra, what's happened to me? Why have I slept so long? He asked. She shrugged, shaking her head slightly. We're not exactly sure what happened to you, she replied. You left in the morning to go hunting, and were gone for hours. Since you're almost never late in returning, I was worried that you'd been hurt. I sent Arden out to find you. Tirion smiled. Arden was the captain of the keep's guards and perhaps his most loyal friend. He should have guessed that Arden would go searching for him. Karandra continued. Just as he was leaving the keep, he came across you atop Mirador. He said that you were unconscious when he found you and that you'd been tied to the saddle with your own reins. Tirion cupped his aching head in his hands. Tied to my saddle? None of this makes any sense, he said wearily. She placed her cool hand against his forehead soothingly. Your ribs were broken and your arm had been sliced open. We feared you had been attacked by a rogue bristlebear. Barthelus healed you as soon as Arden brought you inside. Tirion sat down heavily in her chair. Barthelus? Barthelus had healed him? The youth was only recently anointed as a paladin, and Tirion was surprised to hear that his powers had developed so quickly. The somewhat arrogant but devout Barthelus had been assigned as Tyrion's second, his successor as Lord Paladin over Hearthglen. He had tutored the young paladin in the ways of their holy order and instructed him in the protocols of the political arena. Though he was glad the youth had been able to heal him, he had other matters to ponder. Had the fight with the orc really taken place? I wonder, we should keep track of that name Barthelus in case he's going to end up taking a role in the Scarlet Crusade. Karandra kneeled down close to him. Barthelus' healing taxed you greatly and left him exhausted. As you slept, you cried out a number of times in delirium, she said. He looked at her questioningly. And? He asked. Well, she began with a look of concern crossing her face. You were rambling on about orcs, Tirion. You said that there were orcs in Hearthglen. He laid back in the chair wearily. The memories of the furious encounter came rushing back at him. The fight had been real. He looked into her crystal blue eyes and nodded grimly. It was an orc, he told her. Karandra sat back on her feet, mouth agape. Light save us, she muttered. Just then the door slammed open and 5-year-old Talon came bounding into the room. Papa, Papa! The boy shouted, running over to his parents. Karandra straightened and stood up as Talon leaped up into Tyrion's lap. Tirion grunted as the small boy threw himself against his sore chest. Talon, my boy, how are you? He asked, wrapping his son up in a hearty hug. Talon beamed a coy smile up at him and shrugged his shoulders. Have you been good for your mother? Talon nodded excitedly. He's mindful often enough, Arden's strong voice boomed from the doorway, but he's just as rambunctious as his father ever was. Karandra smiled warmly at the loyal guardsman as he entered the room. I hope I'm not intruding on anything. I saw Talon there, heading this way like a raging ogre, and thought to catch him before I woke you, Tirion. Seems I shouldn't have worried. With a grunt, Tirion rose with Talon in his arms and walked forward to greet his old friend. The two shook hands heartily. Karandra tells me that I should thank you for hauling me back to the keep. Honestly, Arden, I had a gold mark for every time you fished me out of trouble. Nonsense. I just led your horse back. You think anyone should be Barthelus? He just about burned himself out trying to heal you. You're taking a pretty good beating, old friend. In any case, I'm glad to see you back amongst the living. You had us concerned there for a while. I know, Tirion said. There's some things we should discuss immediately. Arden nodded, casting a sidelong look at Talon and Karandra. Catching the captain's subtle hint, Karandra took Talon from Tyrion's arms and said, I'll leave you both to it then. You've got plans to make, and this little one needs to go down for his nap. She kissed the boy on the cheek. Talon, whining with displeasure, struggled to break free of her firm grasp. Karandra laughed softly to herself. Just like his father, she said with a giggle. Both Tirion and Arden smiled as she left. "I'll see you later, son," Tirion said, watching them leave. Once they were out of earshot, he turned to face Arden, his face a mask of concern. "It was an orc, Arden. More than likely it's still alive. As far as I could tell, it was alone out there. And until we know otherwise, I want to keep this between us and whoever else was on hand when you brought me in. I don't want to panic the entire province in case this was just a solitary incident." Arden's strong jaw tightened noticeably. "There may be a problem on that front already, my lord. Bartholus and I were both on hand while you slept. We both heard you mutter about the orc," he said. Tirion grimaced as Arden continued. "You know Bartholus as well as I do. Once he heard you say orc, he flew into a rage and started calling for a full regiment to scour the countryside, search of any more of the brutes. I nearly had to sit on him to calm him down." "I appreciate the lad's enthusiasm, but his fervour could be problematic," Tirion stated wryly. "That would be an understatement," Arden added, smiling. Both men had recognized early on Bartholus' almost zealous obsession to face orcs in battle. Bartholus' parents had been murdered by orcs during the war, which had left the traumatized youth orphaned and inconsolable. Deciding to spend the rest of his life combating the orcs' evil, Bartholus underwent years of rigorous training and study. Yet tragically, the fiery youth was accepted as a paladin only after the war had ended. Despite all his training and preparation, Bartholus was tortured by the fact that he wouldn't have the chance to avenge his slaughtered parents. He also felt that he could only win the respect of his superiors by bloodying his hands gloriously in battle, as they had during the war. He dreamed of becoming a mighty hero and taking vengeance upon the creatures that had taken his family from him. Although he empathized with the younger paladin, Tirion knew that that kind of thinking could lead to disaster. "I doubt he's been tight-mouthed about my encounter, especially after he healed my wounds." "How many know about this, Arden?" Tirion asked anxiously. "Rumour's been flying all around the keep for the past few days. Personally, I've heard just about everything from an orc raiding party to a full-fledged invasion force waiting to descend upon us. You know how it is. People are terrified that the Horde will return, and Bartholus specifically is terrified that he won't get to defeat it single-handedly if it ever does," Arden replied. Tirion patted him reassuringly on the shoulder. "Let's just hope it doesn't come to that," Tirion said in earnest. "Assemble my advisors. We'll discuss this further in council." Arden saluted crisply and turned to leave. Tirion cleared his throat. "Arden," he said softly, "one last thing." Arden stopped in his tracks and stiffened. "You saw the shape I was in when you found me?" "Yes," Arden replied. "There's no way I could have taught myself to Mirador and found my way home in that condition." "No, my lord, there's no way." "And you saw no one else out there? No one who could have helped me and led the horse back here?" "No, my lord, there was no one about. I even went back later to search for tracks. Found nothing. Someone definitely tied you to your horse, and for the life of me I can't figure out who," Arden finished. Tirion nodded and motioned for him to go. Left alone, Tirion pondered on who his anonymous savior could have been. As far as he knew, the only two people in the woods that morning were himself and the mysterious old orc. Briefly, Tirion wondered if it was the orc that had saved him. His past experience with the creatures prompted him to disregard the notion. The bestial creatures had no notion of honor. From all he had seen of them, he was certain that they would never go out of their way to show compassion toward another creature, least of all a hated enemy. Still, despite his convictions, Tyrion's instincts told him that it had been the orc after all. Yeah, you know it is. Candles fluttered in the medium-sized council room. At the room's center sat a large oak table covered by an immense map that displayed the lands of Hearthglen down to the most minute detail. 6 men were seated around the table conversing amongst themselves. At the head of the table sat Tirion, who stared quietly at the section of map that indicated the woodlands surrounding the ruined tower. Lost in thought, Tirion was disinterested in his advisor's idle conversation. He couldn't tear his mind from the nagging question. Who had saved him and led his horse home? He remembered clearly that the orc had saluted him when he allowed the creature a reprieve during their combat. Perhaps the brute had some semblance of honor after all, Tirion mused. No, it had to be a mistake. Orcs were vile and savage. Their kind knew nothing of civility or compassion, he reminded himself. But still his heart told him that it was the orc who had saved him. His thoughts were interrupted as the door swung open to admit a tall, slender young man. Resplendent in his silver plate armor with a deep green cloak flowing behind him, Bartholus looked every bit the crusading paladin. Though he was nearly 30 years younger than Tirion, Bartholus held his oath as a knight of the Silver Hand as sacred as the elder paladin did. As always, Bartholus moved with a fluid grace, barely even acknowledging the presence of the other men in the room. Brash and somewhat pompous, Bartholus rarely went out of his way to acknowledge anyone who was not a light-blessed paladin. Tirion stood and saluted the younger man as he entered. "Greetings, Bartholus. I thank you for your healing. If not for you, I'd have gone on my way to join the light," Tirion said, rubbing his still sore ribs. Although his wounds had healed completely, his body was still tender. Bartholus shook his head dismissively and returned Tyrion's salute. "It was nothing, my lord. I did just as you would have done for me if the circumstances had been reversed," Bartholus said confidently. "I dearly wish that it had been me facing that orc. If I had, its head would now adorn the keep's battlements." Tirion noticed a few of the advisors exchanging surprised glances. As was usually the case, the young paladin's enthusiasm bordered on impertinence. Tirion smiled at the young man with practiced patience. "Which, of course," Bartholus continued, "is not to say that you couldn't have defeated the brute yourself, my lord." "Well, I'm sure you would have put the fear of the Alliance into it at least, Bartholus. Just the same for the time being, I don't want any of you discussing this matter with anyone else. I'd rather not rile the citizenry until we have a better understanding of what we're dealing with here," Tirion said. Bartholus nearly choked. "My lord, with respect, are you suggesting that we keep silent while the enemy creeps unhindered through our lands? We must scour the woods immediately. Every second we waste here could provide the orcs with enough time to—" Tirion cut him off. "You are assuming that there are more orcs out there, Bartholus. I was there and I saw none. I will not sound the call to arms before we've confirmed the facts. This is not the time to start jumping at shadows. We must remain calm and be vigilant." "Jumping at shadows? An orcish force somehow slips undetected into our lands. One of its members beats you to a pulp, and you want to remain calm? This is madness." A few of the advisors gasped at the young man's audacity, but Bartholus continued unabated. "We should mobilize a hunting party right this instant." Tirion clenched his fists and tried to keep his voice even. The advisors, who had kept silent during their heated exchange, seemed incensed by Bartholus's disrespectful rantings. "You watch your tone with me, boy. I am still governor of this province and your direct superior as a paladin. For so long as I am, we will do things the way I see fit. You are to stand down and remain within the keep's grounds until I order you to do otherwise. Is that clear?" Tirion growled. Bartholus was beside himself with rage. "I hope and pray to the light that my lord isn't so shaken by his recent beating that he fears to do his clear duty." "That will be enough, Bartholus. You've gone too far," one of the councillors shouted. Bristling with anger, Tirion stepped up to the young paladin and looked him dead in the eye. "You may leave my council room now," he said to Bartholus. The young paladin choked back his rage and steadied himself. He calmed visibly. "Of course, my lord," he said in a strained voice. "I will await your orders eagerly." With that he snapped a crisp salute and left the room. "Yes, I'm sure you will," Tirion said grimly. Everyone seemed to sigh as the tension drained from the room. Tirion rubbed his eyes wearily and sat back down. One of his advisors spoke. "My lord, he is brash, but he is a good man at heart. I'm sure he didn't mean—" "I know what he is, and I know what he meant. Bartholus has always been ruled by his passions. They will make him an exceptional paladin. However, they'll also make him a liability in delicate situations," Tirion stated. He felt tired like an old man. Once he calms down, he'll come around. He always does. "But, my lord, what if he's right? What if there are more orcs out there waiting to strike at us, and we sit here and do nothing?" the advisor asked. Tirion ran his fingers over the spot on the map that indicated the broken tower. "Under no circumstances will I do nothing, old friend. I'll take care of this matter myself." Before they had a chance to argue the point further, he rose and walked toward the exit, leaving the advisors to stare at one another in confusion. But on the off chance that he is right, may the light help us all. Later that evening, Tirion sat alone in the keep's spacious dining hall. His plate of food had gone cold, and he picked at it absently with his fork. He was thinking about the old orc again. Was it truly possible that the orc had saved his life? He would have to find out soon. If Bartholus was right, then everything he'd worked for could come crashing down at any moment. Behind him he heard a quiet scuffling of small feet. Looking around, he saw sleepy-eyed Talon emerging from the adjoining sitting room. "Shouldn't you be asleep, young man?" he asked. The boy crawled into his lap and looked up at him in awe. Tirion smiled at his son, thinking how much the boy resembled his mother. Sandy blonde hair, big blue eyes. He was certainly a sweet, innocent child, Tirion thought. "Did the green men come back again, Papa?" Talon asked. Tirion nodded and ruffled the boy's hair. Yes, but you don't need to worry, son. You'll be safe enough here in the keep. Are you going to fight the green men, Papa? The boy asked. Tyrion's brow creased. I don't know yet, son. I just don't know. All right, so we got some dialogue and it became more of a story. I like that. We have a short. There always has to be antagonism, some kind of dramatic tension, a villain of some sort in these type of stories. So we have that now in the form of his second in command, Bartholus. He could serve as a villain role. That's my guess. We're already a quarter of the way through this. We need some. I would imagine we've got, if we're going to really treat this as a story of two sides humanizing one another or empathizing with one another, then we've got to give equal treatment to the orc. We've already spent a quarter of the book basically on Tirion. So it'd be nice to get some time from the orc's perspective. So hopefully we do that in the next chapter or so, but maybe it won't do that at all. All right, we have this episode in the pipe 5x5. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing everybody next time on Lore of Warcraft.